church. Hope our few are doing well today. I imagine we're going to be very thin this morning with people traveling for the holidays, but thank you for joining us here. So let's go ahead and get started with a prayer. God, we are so thankful for this time when we can come together, this time when we come into your presence as a community, as a church, as a family. And I pray that you will bless our time together this morning and bless our study of the book of Genesis. And I just pray that we can glean some knowledge from that, some understanding from that. And please be with everyone in our family who is traveling and keep them safe and give them a blessed time with the people who they're going to see. And in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right. So last week we talked about Abraham and his call from the east back to the west, right? Back towards Eden and this relationship with God. And today we're going to talk about perhaps what is the most pivotal text for Abraham's narrative, which is Genesis 15. Now, Genesis 15 is the passage where Abram and God confirm their covenant, where they make their covenant official. And it comes with this confirmation of these three things that Abram has been promised: land, air, and providence. And it's at this time that we sort of see Abram fully buy into this story that God is creating. And additionally, if you recall in our study of Galatians, this is sort of the pivotal text, the crucial text, the critical text for how Paul sees God making someone a part of his family. And we'll see why in just a little bit. So let's go ahead and turn to Genesis 15. We'll begin reading in verse 1. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward." But Abram said, "Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus?" And Abram said, "You have given me no children, so a servant in my house will be my heir." Then the word of the Lord came to him, "This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir." He took him outside and said, "Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them." Then he said to him, "So shall your offspring be." Abram believed in the Lord, and he credited to him as righteousness. All right. So we'll pause there, because just packed into these 6 short verses is a lot of important theology, important things to understand about this story. So, at this point in the story, Abram, he's seemingly been in the land for a long time. So, between chapter 12 and chapter 15, a lot has happened. Abram has been doing a lot of things, and there's no specification of how many years he's been there, but we can assume it's been a while. And still, these promises of God remain unfulfilled, right? Abram does not possess this land. Abram still does not have a biological heir. And Eliezer, the slave in his house, the servant, is his heir. And this was a somewhat common practice at the time, where if there was someone who didn't have an heir, essentially you could go up and say, "Hey, I'm going to serve you in exchange for being your heir." And so this is likely what's going on with Eliezer. He's serving Abram for the right to become his heir. And interestingly, we will see this sort of continuation of Abram try to twist these promises a little bit, right? Abram is trying to fulfill this promise that God has given him in some way that he can fathom. Because he's old and he doesn't think that he can have a child, and so he thinks, okay, if I'm supposed to have an heir, then I'll try to do it myself. And in chapter 16, we'll see him go to further extremes with Hagar and Ishmael, that story. We'll see him sort of try to do things his own way. So God's response to Abram's complaints. I don't know if I want to call it a complaint, but I can't think of a better word, because Abram is somewhat justified in feeling this way, right? Abram has been given this promise, and yet it's still unfulfilled even after all these years. But God's response to this is to show Abram the grandeur of creation. There's this line in one of the commentaries that I've been using from Walter Brueggemann, who's one of the greatest Old Testament theologians of our time, who said this about this moment when he takes Abram outside and tells him to try to count the stars. It's not an argument, but a revelation. It's important for us to remember that at this time, Abram is operating in a world without Scripture, right? He's operating in a world without these long-standing traditions of the church, right? And so his only understanding of God, his only way to interact with God has to come through his own relationship with God and his own experiences of God. And if we're lucky, we've all had experiences like Abraham has had in this passage, where the presence of God is expressed to us, where the reality of God that we worship isn't based on our cultural ideas of who or what God is, but this almost primal awareness of who and what God is. And it's not the words that make Abram believe, right? He's arguing with God over these words. But it is the stars and the beauty of creation. And so I think the problem that we run into a lot in the modern day is that we want our belief to be centered around the material. And what I mean by that is we want it to be centered around something that we can manage. But we have to understand that God is much bigger than the simple things that we can touch and control and understand. So this moment, yeah, Robert. Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. So, as we said, this moment is incredibly crucial for the development of Paul's theology of faith and justification. So, God reckons Abram's belief as righteousness before this covenantal ceremony that we're about to read of has been completed, right? Before the law has been given, right? So there are not these things that are making Abraham righteous before God. It is faith that becomes this ultimate arbiter, right? Abram's faith that God can do what he has promised, that God is doing something in the world. Now, that doesn't mean that Abram doesn't also bear a responsibility, right? And I think that that too often is how Christians have read Paul, is that if we have faith, then we're under no obligation to do anything. We don't have any requirements in our life. There's nothing else we have to do. And that because we have faith, our duty is irrelevant. But the point of faith, as Paul talks about in Galatians, and this is kind of the whole crux of our series that we just went through, is that faith isn't relegated to one people group. It's not relegated to one type of person. Anyone can participate in faith. And that's what's different between that and the law, where the law is given to one specific people group for a specific purpose. But this passage is showing us that God is bigger than the law, right? God existed before the law, He exists after the law, and it is faithfulness which is what brings people into God's family. So let's continue reading in verse 7. He also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you the land to take possession of it. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? So the Lord said to him, Bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abram brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Then birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nations they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, To your descendants I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, Kenizzites, Kadamites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephates, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. All right. So this ancient ritual is enacted as confirmation of this promise, right? Where these two halves pass through these animal carcasses as a way of affirming their commitment to the promise that they've made to each other. Now, we don't really know exactly what's going on in this ritual. I mean, there's speculation, but it's just one of those things that's sort of lost to time a little bit. But what's crucial about this, and what we can glean from this, what's important is that both Abram and God participate in this ritual, right? It's not just Abram passing through and holding himself accountable to these promises. It's Abram and God who pass through. And so God is holding himself accountable for these promises that are being made. So waiting becomes this major theme through the Abrahamic narrative. And I think in our modern day, the point that the text is trying to make is perhaps even a little more pronounced than it was then. I think nowadays we expect this instant gratification without a lot of effort on our part, between the way that the internet has sort of closed the world, in our relationships, in so many parts of our life. Waiting has become nothing more than a major inconvenience. But faith requires waiting, right? Faith that redemption is coming, that newness is coming, that Jesus is coming, requires living life in these very small steps and knowing that God is working in the world, which becomes very difficult. And we have to ask ourselves the question, can we accept that? Are we okay with a world that every time it seems that we get a little closer to what God has imagined or wanted, we seem to take 10 steps back? And the other question is, can we play our part, right? Can we play our part in this covenant, right? This is not God going at it alone. This is God inviting us into something. This is what this ceremony is showing us, is that not only do we expect something from God, God expects something from us. This is a mutual relationship in which we are building something together. So that is what we want to think about in this text, this very crucial text. And we'll come back for some discussion.